What if I told you one of the Bible's greatest love stories isn't just about romance? What if this story contains themes of loyalty that would put modern friendships to shame, a tragedy that rivals Shakespeare's best works, and a tale of redemption that prefigures the gospel itself? Please kindly subscribe to our channel for more biblical study. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into what might be the most underrated book of the Bible, the Book of Ruth. Now, I know what you're thinking. Ruth, that short book tucked between Judges and Samuel, the one we usually skip over on our way to the action-packed stories of King David? You see, Ruth often gets overlooked for several reasons. First, it's short, just 4 chapters long. Second, it doesn't have any dramatic miracles like the parting of the Red Sea or the walls of Jericho falling. And third, it's a story that takes place mostly in fields and on threshing floors, not exactly the epic battlegrounds we find in other biblical narratives. But this is exactly why we need to pay attention, because sometimes the most profound truths aren't found in the spectacular, but in the ordinary. Ruth's story unfolds in the everyday lives of ordinary people, facing extraordinary challenges. Set in the time of the Judges, when Israel was facing political and moral chaos, this book stands out as a beacon of hope and faithfulness. But here's what makes it truly remarkable. It's a masterpiece of narrative that connects to every major theme in the Bible. In these 4 short chapters, we find divine providence working through human choices, redemption that spans both the personal and the universal, the inclusion of outsiders into God's people, and a crucial link in the lineage that leads to Jesus Christ himself. But perhaps most importantly, Ruth's story shows us that no life is too ordinary for God to use. No person too foreign for God to include, and no situation too hopeless for God to redeem. In the next half hour, we're going to unpack this remarkable book, and I promise you by the end of this video, you'll never see Ruth the same way again. You'll discover why this simple love story is actually one of the most sophisticated and meaningful narratives in Scripture. To truly appreciate Ruth's story, we need to step back in time, about 3,100 years ago to be exact. The year is around 1100 BCE, and Israel is in what historians call the period of the Judges. Picture this. The great leader Joshua has died. The Israelites have settled in the Promised Land, but there's no central government, no unified kingdom. Instead, we have a loose confederation of tribes, each doing their best to survive in a hostile environment. The Book of Judges puts it bluntly. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. This was a dark time in Israel's history. Cycles of sin, oppression, crying out to God, and deliverance through Judges mark this era. But our story doesn't begin with a mighty judge or a great battle. Instead, it begins with a famine in Bethlehem, a name that ironically means house of bread. Now here's where it gets interesting. This famine wasn't just a natural disaster. It was deeply theological. In the covenant God made with Israel, famine was often a sign of divine judgment. For Bethlehem, the breadbasket of Judah, to run out of bread, this was a crisis of both physical and spiritual proportions. This famine forces our story's family to make a desperate choice, to leave their homeland and travel to Moab, about 50 miles east across the Dead Sea. But here's what you need to understand about Moab. The Moabites and Israelites, they weren't exactly friendly neighbors. The Moabites were descendants of Lot through an incestuous relationship, and their history with Israel was complicated, to say the least. They had denied Israel passage during the Exodus, hired Balaam to curse Israel, and their women had led Israelite men into idolatry. There was no love lost between these peoples. But the cultural tensions don't stop there. We're talking about a patriarchal society where women's security and status depended entirely on their male relatives. A woman without a husband or sons? She was in serious trouble. And this brings us to one of the most vulnerable classes in ancient Israel, the widow. In this society, widows had few rights and fewer options. Without a male protector, they often faced poverty, exploitation, and social isolation. This is why God's law specifically commanded Israel to protect widows, along with orphans and foreigners. The problem? These laws weren't always followed. This is the world Ruth steps into, a world where being a widow was hard enough, but being a foreign widow? That puts you at the absolute bottom of the social ladder, and yet it's precisely this setting that makes what happens next so remarkable. Women in ancient Israel typically worked within strict social boundaries. They drew water, prepared food, made textiles, and helped with harvesting, but they were always under the protection and authority of their male relatives. A woman alone was vulnerable to exploitation or worse. So when we read about Ruth going out to glean in the fields, we need to understand just how brave and potentially dangerous this action was. She was stepping out of every social safety net her culture provided. This is the stage God chose for one of the most beautiful stories of redemption in Scripture, a time of moral chaos, a place of ethnic tensions, and a social system that seems stacked against our main characters. And yet, as we're about to see, God was at work in ways no one could have imagined. What if I told you that the Book of Ruth isn't just a beautiful story, but a masterpiece of literary craftsmanship? Let's unlock the literary treasures hidden within these 4 carefully constructed chapters. The book's structure is nothing short of brilliant. Think of it as a perfectly balanced diamond with 4 facets. Each chapter isn't just a continuation of the story, it's a carefully crafted movement in a larger symphony. Please kindly subscribe to our channel for more biblical study. Chapter 1, The Loss, opens with death and emptiness, moves from Bethlehem to Moab and back, introduces our key theme of Hesed through Ruth's loyalty. Chapter 2, The Meeting. Providence brings Ruth to Boaz's field. First hints of redemption appear. Hope begins to dawn in the story. Chapter 3, The Request. The midnight encounter at the threshing floor. A bold plan meets honorable response. Ancient customs meet personal choice. Chapter 4, The Redemption. Legal proceedings at the city gate. Marriage and birth. From emptiness to fullness. Now let's talk about something fascinating. The Hebrew terms that carry the story's deeper meaning. 3 key words illuminate everything. First, Hesed, usually translated as kindness or loyalty, but it's so much more. This is covenant, faithfulness, a love that acts beyond obligation. We see it in Ruth's commitment to Naomi, in Boaz's protection of Ruth, and ultimately it reflects God's faithful love for his people. Second, Ga'al, to redeem. This word appears 23 times in this short book. It's not just about buying back property, it's about restoring life itself. When Boaz becomes Ruth's goel, or redeemer, he's participating in a divine pattern that points to a greater redeemer. And third, shuv, to return. This word's repeated use creates a powerful motif of restoration. Naomi returns to Bethlehem, Ruth returns with her, and through their story, blessing returns to a family that seemed cursed. The author uses several sophisticated literary devices that might be invisible to us, but would have delighted ancient audiences. One chiastic structure, the story moves from fullness to emptiness and back to fullness. Each scene is carefully balanced with its counterpart. 2. Dialogue mastery. Over half the book is dialogue. Each character's speech reveals their nature. Word plays and double meanings enrich the text. 3. Narrative gaps. The author intentionally leaves spaces for us to ponder. What was Ruth's life like in Moab? What really happened on the threshing floor? But perhaps most fascinating are the parallel stories woven throughout. Ruth's story echoes in contrast with other biblical narratives. Like Abraham, Ruth leaves her homeland for an unknown future. Like Tamar, she's a foreigner who ensures the family line continues. Like Israel itself, she finds refuge under God's wings. Each parallel adds layers of meaning to the story, The beauty of Ruth's literary structure is that it serves the story's purpose perfectly. Every word, every scene, every parallel points to the larger themes of redemption, providence, and he said. This isn't just good storytelling with divine inspiration working through human craftsmanship. Understanding these literary elements doesn't diminish the story's power, it enhances it. Like a master painting, the closer you look, the more beauty you discover. Imagine losing everything, and I mean everything. Your home, your husband, your sons, your entire future. This is Naomi's story. We first meet Naomi as a wife and mother, forced by famine to leave her hometown of Bethlehem. But watch how quickly tragedy strikes. First, her husband Elimelech dies. Then, after her sons marry Moabite. Women, both sons die too. 10 years, 3 graves, 0 grandchildren. And this is where Naomi makes one of the most heartbreaking statements in Scripture. Returning to Bethlehem, she tells the townspeople, "Don't call me Naomi," which means pleasant. "Call me Mara," meaning bitter. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. But here's what makes Naomi's story so powerful. It doesn't end in bitterness. Despite her pain, she becomes something unexpected, a master strategist in God's redemption plan. Watch how she guides Ruth through the customs of Israel. Every instruction she gives is calculated. When to approach Boaz, how to approach him, what to say. This isn't just a grieving widow. This is a woman who knows exactly how redemption works in Israel. And slowly, through Ruth's loyalty and Boaz's kindness, we see Naomi transform. The woman who came, home empty, leaves the story with a grandson on her lap, a child who will become the grandfather of King David himself. In the end, the women of Bethlehem tell Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer." The bitter waters of Mara have become sweet again. Naomi, pleasant, has her name back. And perhaps that's the most powerful part of her story. Sometimes God's greatest redemption stories begin with our deepest losses. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. These words, spoken by a young Moabite widow, would echo through history as one of the most profound declarations of loyalty ever recorded. But let's understand just how radical Ruth's choice really was. Picture this, a young woman standing at the crossroads of her life. Behind her lies everything familiar, her homeland, her family, her gods. Ahead lies uncertainty, complete uncertainty. As a Moabite, Ruth wasn't just choosing to follow her mother-in-law. She was choosing to become a stranger in a strange land. Remember, Moabites were considered enemies of Israel. They were excluded from the assembly of the Lord to the 10th generation. Yet here she stands, choosing the unknown over the familiar, choosing loyalty over safety. Please kindly subscribe to our channel for more biblical study. Watch how Ruth grows through the story. From gleaning leftover grain to becoming the owner of the field, from being called the Moabite to being named in Jesus' genealogy, from a widow with no future to becoming the great-grandmother of King David. But it's not just Ruth's story that's remarkable, it's how she lives it. Look at the virtues she exemplifies. Loyalty? She refuses to abandon Naomi. Initiative? She goes out to work in the fields. Wisdom? She follows Naomi's counsel perfectly. Courage? She approaches Boaz at the threshing floor. Humility? She never demands, only requests. Ruth becomes a picture of what theologians call a true convert. Not someone who just changes religions, but someone who experiences a complete transformation of identity and loyalty. And here's the beautiful irony. This foreigner becomes essential to Israel's royal line, and ultimately to the lineage of the Messiah himself. From Ruth, we learn that true faith isn't about where you're from, it's about where you're going. That real loyalty means betting your whole future on the bonds of love. That sometimes the greatest acts of faith look like ordinary choices made with extraordinary courage. In a story filled with remarkable women, Boaz emerges as a man who redefines what it means to be truly righteous. He's not just a wealthy landowner, he's what the Hebrew Bible calls a goel, a kinsman, redeemer. Now let's understand this crucial concept. A kinsman redeemer was a close relative who had the legal right and responsibility as to act on behalf of a family member in crisis. They could buy back lost property, free relatives from slavery, preserve the family name, provide for widows. But what makes Boaz extraordinary isn't just what he does, it's how he does it. Watch his first interaction with Ruth. He doesn't just allow her to glean, he goes above and beyond the legal requirements. 1. He ensures her safety. Stay close to my young women. 2. He provides extra protection. I have commanded the young men not to touch you. 3. He offers additional provisions. When you are thirsty, drink from the vessels. This is a man who understood that true righteousness isn't just about following rules, it's about reflecting God's heart. Notice how he addresses Ruth, a foreign widow. The Lord repay you for what you have done. He sees her, values her, and publicly acknowledges her virtue. But perhaps Boaz's finest moment comes at the city gate. There was another redeemer with a prior claim to Ruth. Boaz could have stepped aside. Legally, he would have been blameless. Instead, he navigates the situation with wisdom and integrity, ensuring both the letter and the spirit of the law are fulfilled. In Boaz, we see leadership marked by protection without patronizing, generosity without drawing attention, justice tempered with kindness, righteousness beyond mere rules. He becomes a picture of what theologians would later see as a type of Christ, the ultimate kinsman, redeemer who would go far beyond legal requirements to save his people. There's a word in Hebrew that appears throughout the Book of Ruth, a word so rich in meaning that English translations struggle to capture its essence. That word is hesed. We often translate hesed as kindness or loving kindness, but it's so much more. Imagine love, loyalty, mercy, and faithfulness all woven together. It's covenant love in action, going beyond what duty requires, persisting when everything seems hopeless. The Book of Ruth is saturated with hesed, appearing like golden threads in a tapestry. Let's watch it unfold. First, we see it in Ruth's declaration to Naomi, "Where you go, I will go." She could have returned to her family, rebuilt her life. Instead, she chooses a path of sacrificial love. Then we see it in Boaz's response to Ruth. "All that you have done for your mother-in-law has been fully told to me." He recognizes and honors her hest with his own acts of extraordinary kindness. Finally, we see it in Naomi's transformation. From bitter emptiness to joyful fullness, all through the hest of others. But here's where this ancient concept crashes into our modern world. Hest isn't just a beautiful idea. From the past, it's a radical way of living that challenges us today. Think about it. When was the last time you saw someone choose loyalty over convenience? What would it look like to go beyond mere obligation in your relationships? How might Hesed transform your community? In a world of disposable relationships and casual commitments, Hesed calls us to something deeper. To love when it costs us something. To stay faithful when walking away would be easier. To show kindness that goes beyond what's expected. Please kindly subscribe to our channel for more biblical study. The beauty of Hesed is that it reflects God's own character. Just as he remains faithful to his promises, just as his love endures forever, we're invited to practice this same kind of transformative love in our own lives. What does redemption look like? In the Book of Ruth, it's not just a spiritual concept. It unfolds as a beautiful tapestry of personal, national, and prophetic restoration. Let's start with the personal redemption stories that weave through this narrative. Naomi's redemption, from "I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty," to holding her grandson, surrounded by women saying, "Blessed be the Lord." From Mara, bitter, back to Naomi, pleasant, Ruth's redemption, from widowed foreigner gleaning leftovers, to respected wife and mother in Israel, from Moabite outsider to great-grandmother of King David. Boaz's redemption, from a wealthy but likely unmarried older man, to husband and father, to a vital link in God's redemptive plan. But this intimate family story ripples out into something much bigger. Remember when this story takes place during the time of the Judges, one of Israel's darkest periods. A time of moral chaos, no king in Israel, everyone doing what was right in their own eyes. Yet in this darkness, we see foreign nations being grafted into Israel, God's faithfulness to his covenant promises, the preparation for Israel's golden age under David. And here's where the story takes an extraordinary turn. This isn't just about one family's restoration, it's pointing to something far greater. 1. The line of David. Ruth and Boaz's son Obed becomes David's grandfather. The story ends with David's genealogy. 2. The promise of Messiah. A foreign woman enters the royal lineage. Bethlehem becomes significant again. The kinsman-redeemer pattern points to Christ. 3. The nation's inclusion. Ruth the Moabite becomes part of God's people, foreshadowing Gentile inclusion in God's family. This is redemption in its fullest sense. Personal pain transformed into purpose. National renewal through individual faithfulness. God's global plan of salvation unfolding through ordinary lives. And perhaps that's the most beautiful part of Ruth's redemption story. It reminds us that our personal stories of redemption are never just about us. They're part of God's greater story of redeeming all things. As it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. This simple phrase in Ruth 2:3 might be one of the greatest understatements in Scripture, because what looks like chance is actually divine, choreography at its finest. Let's trace the coincidences in Ruth's story. A famine drives a family to Moab. Ruth happens to marry into this Israelite family. She happens to choose Israel over Moab. She happens to glean in Boaz's field. Boaz happens to be a kinsman redeemer. He happens to be a man of noble character. None of these are accidents. Transition to timeline graphic. Watch how God turns famine into fullness. First scene, there was a famine in the land. Last scene, and she bore a son. Between these bookends, we see empty hands filled with grain, empty hearts filled with love, empty wombs filled with life. But here's what makes Ruth's story so powerful. God never appears in a burning bush. No seas part. No. Angels make announcements. Instead, we see divine providence working through a mother-in-law's guidance, a farmer's generosity, a midnight conversation, a legal transaction. This is providence in work clothes. God orchestrating redemption through ordinary people making choices, daily acts of kindness, simple acts of faith, regular business dealings. Like a master weaver, God is working all these threads together. Personal decisions, cultural customs, perfect timing, human faithfulness, all creating a tapestry more beautiful than anyone could have imagined. Please kindly subscribe to our channel for more biblical study. And here's the hope for us. Just as God was working in all the seeming coincidences of Ruth's life, He's working in ours. When we can't see His hand, we can trust His heart. When life seems random, He's writing a story. When circumstances appear meaningless, He's moving toward redemption. From famine to fullness, from emptiness to abundance, from chance meetings to divine appointments. This is the God who works in the ordinary to accomplish the extraordinary. What begins as a widow's journey home transforms into one of the most theologically significant narratives in Scripture. The Book of Ruth is like a seed that grows into a mighty tree with branches, reaching into the very heart of God's redemptive plan. Let's start with the Davidic connection. The book ends with a genealogy that seems almost surprising, until you realize its profound significance. Boaz, Obed, Jesse, David. This isn't just a family tree. It's the royal line of Israel. Through Ruth's faithfulness, a Moabite widow, becomes the great-grandmother of Israel's greatest king, but the significance runs even deeper. The messianic implications are staggering. Consider these parallels. 1. Bethlehem's role. Ruth's story centers in Bethlehem. David will be born in Bethlehem, and ultimately Jesus will be born in this same town. 2. The kinsman-redeemer pattern. Boaz is the kinsman-redeemer who pays a price, takes a Gentile bride, restores an inheritance, provides an heir. All of these foreshadow Christ's redemptive work. In the grand narrative of salvation history, Ruth occupies a crucial position. She bridges the period of Judges to the Kingdom era. She brings Gentile blood into the messianic line. She demonstrates God's universal plan of redemption. She shows how individual faithfulness connects to cosmic purposes. But perhaps one of the most revolutionary aspects of Ruth's story is its model for Gentile inclusion. In a time when ethnic boundaries were rigid, Ruth demonstrates that faith, not ethnicity, determines belonging. Outsiders can become insiders through covenant loyalty. God's family extends beyond national boundaries. Divine blessing flows through unexpected channels. This inclusion theme echoes through Scripture. Isaiah's vision of all nations streaming to God's mountain. Jesus' ministry to Gentiles. Paul's teaching about grafting in of the Gentiles. John's vision of every tribe and tongue worshiping together. Ruth's story anticipates it all. The theological richness continues in how the book portrays divine providence, God working through ordinary circumstances, sovereign guidance without miraculous intervention, personal choices carrying cosmic significance, covenant faithfulness, human hesed reflecting divine hesed, promises kept despite difficult circumstances, faith expressed through practical actions. Consider how this short book connects to major biblical themes: election and inclusion, faith and works, law and grace, divine and human activity, individual and corporate salvation. In the end, Ruth's theological significance lies in how it shows us God's heart for the nations, the integration of human and divine activity, the cosmic significance of personal faithfulness, the foreshadowing of Christ's redemptive work. This simple love story turns out to be a pivotal chapter in God's redemptive plan, showing us that no life is too ordinary, no background too foreign, and no situation too hopeless for God to use in His divine purpose. What does a 3,000-year-old story about a widow and her mother-in-law have to say to us today? As it turns out, everything. In a world of ghosting and casual commitments, Ruth's loyalty feels almost radical. Imagine posting her words on social media: "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God." In an age of easy abandonment, this is what unshakable loyalty looks like. Let's bring Ruth into our world. Modern loyalty looks like staying with aging parents despite career opportunities elsewhere, supporting friends through mental health struggles, committing to a community when moving would be easier, choosing difficult relationships over comfortable isolation. In our increasingly divided world, Ruth and Boaz's cross-cultural relationship speaks volumes. A Moabite and an Israelite, different religions, different social classes, different life experiences. Yet they build bridges, not walls. They show us how to move past prejudices, value character over background, create family across cultural lines, build inclusive communities. Living through tough times, Ruth knows about that. Economic hardship, she was there. Cultural adjustment, she faced it. Starting over, she did it. Uncertain future, she lived it. Her story reminds us that hope isn't about circumstances, it's about choices. But perhaps the most encouraging part of Ruth's story is its ordinariness. No miraculous interventions, no dramatic visions, no burning bushes, just ordinary people making faithful choices in everyday moments. This means your ordinary life matters. That daily choice to be kind, that decision to stay faithful, that small act of generosity, that moment of choosing integrity. These aren't just good deeds. They're part of a bigger story. Ruth teaches us that every act of kindness matters. Every choice to stay faithful counts. Every bridge we build makes a difference. Every ordinary day holds extraordinary potential. Because just like Ruth, we never know how our daily choices might be part of a larger story, one that extends far beyond what we can see. Please kindly subscribe to our channel for more biblical study.